A powerful young executive walked into a boardroom convinced she could run a $100 million company on spreadsheets and instinct alone. And she never once imagined that the quiet man mopping up her failures would end up holding the only thing that could save her. This is the story of the fall of a woman who thought competence meant control, and the rise of a man who never stopped being brilliant. He just stopped needing anyone to know it. If you enjoy stories where pride gets humbled and quiet integrity wins. In the end, press subscribe now so you do not miss how this one ends. Vivian Cole had not slept more than 5 hours a night since she took over as chief executive of Hartwell Systems. And on the morning everything fell apart, she was already awake before her alarm, staring at a ceiling she did not remember falling asleep under. Her father had built Hartwell from a single server rack in a rented office in 1994, and when he retired 3 years ago, the board had installed her as the natural heir. Young, sharp, Ivy League polished, hungry to prove she was not just a name on a door. She had spent those 3 years cutting costs, trimming what she called dead weight, and rewarding the loud, ambitious people who told her what she wanted to hear. She did not know, not yet, that the quietest man in the building had been the one holding the entire company together with his bare hands for 10 years. Daniel Reyes had worked in the server room at Hartwell Systems since before Vivian ever set foot in the executive suite. He was 41 years old, a widower, and the father of a 9-year-old girl named Sophie, who had her mother's eyes and an old soul that made teachers describe her as remarkably perceptive for her age. Daniel had taken the IT technician job a decade ago because it paid steady and let him be home most nights, and over the years he had quietly rebuilt Hartwell's entire server infrastructure from the inside out, patchwork solutions layered over patchwork solutions. Systems he understood so intimately that he had stopped writing documentation because there had never been anyone else who needed to read it. He kept his head down, he fixed what broke, he picked Sophie up from school on Wednesdays. He did not talk about the fact that he used to be somebody else, somebody with a different last name, in different rooms, because that life had ended the night his wife died, and he had promised himself he would never again let ambition pull him away from his daughter. Vivian did not know Daniel's name until the day Marcus Doyle told her to get rid of him. Marcus was the company's chief operating officer, and he was also, more troublingly, her second cousin, a fact the board found charming and Vivian had started to find exhausting. He had a square jaw, an expensive haircut, and the kind of confidence that came from never once being told no. He had wanted the chief executive chair for himself when the old man retired, and he had smiled through his disappointment for 3 years while quietly building a coalition of board members who thought Vivian was too cautious, too soft, not enough like her father. Marcus stood in her office that Tuesday morning, with the printout of the technician's salary and benefits circled in red ink, and he told her that Hartwell was bleeding money on legacy headcount, people doing jobs that could be automated or outsourced, and that cutting the fat would show the board she had teeth. "This one," Marcus said, tapping Daniel's name on the page, "has been coasting for years. Nobody even knows what he actually does down there. We bring in a managed services contract, save $400,000 a year, and you look decisive doing it. Hent and Saf." Vivian had looked at the name, Daniel Reyes, IT infrastructure technician, and felt nothing, because names on payroll reports were not people to her. They were line items, and she had trained herself for 3 years not to feel the weight of line items. She told Marcus to draft the termination and have legal review it. She did not ask what Daniel actually did down there. She did not ask anyone. Daniel was called into a small conference room on a Thursday afternoon, and Vivian was there in a charcoal suit with her arms crossed, letting Marcus do the talking. Because that was easier than looking a person in the eye while you dismantled their life. Marcus explained in the smooth corporate language of transitions and restructuring and right-sizing that Hartwell would be moving to a third-party managed services provider, and that Daniel's position was, regrettably, being eliminated effective immediately. Daniel sat very still. He asked, quietly, whether anyone had reviewed the documentation on the failover systems, because there wasn't any, not written down, and the new provider would need at least a 2-week transition window to avoid problems. Marcus waved a hand and said the new team was world-class. They'd figure it out. That was what they were paid for. Vivian, who had not said a word yet, finally looked at Daniel directly for the first time in the conversation and said, in the flat voice she used for board memos, that Hartwell needed people who brought more to the table and that everyone was replaceable if the company was going to grow. She did not say it cruelly. She said it the way she said most things, efficiently, without weight, already thinking about her next meeting. Daniel did not argue. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with people who had already decided was a waste of breath that could be spent elsewhere. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and he said quietly, "You'll want to keep that thought in mind." It was not a threat. His voice did not rise. It was almost gentle, the way a man speaks, when he already knows something the room does not, and Vivian would think about that sentence more in the next 48 hours than she had thought about anything in years. He packed his one box, a coffee mug Sophie had painted for him, a photograph, a spare charging cable, and he left the building without asking for severance, without making a scene, and Vivian watched him go from her office window and felt, for just a moment, something uncomfortably close to doubt before she buried it under the next item on her calendar. Daniel picked Sophie up from school that afternoon. Like it was any other day, he did not tell her yet that he'd lost his job. He let her talk the whole ride home about a science project involving vinegar and baking soda, and he nodded in the right places. And it was only after she'd gone to bed that he sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and let himself feel the specific, familiar ache of being discarded by people who had never bothered to understand what he was worth. He had felt this before, a long time ago, under a different name, in a different life, and he had promised himself back then that he would never again build his identity around being indispensable to people who did not see him as a person. He thought of Sophie, asleep down the hall, and he thought, "At least I still have this. At least this part of my life nobody can fire me from." He did not know yet that the walls he had spent 10 years quietly propping up were already beginning, somewhere in the dark server room he used to call his own, to lean. The first alerts came in, around 2 in the morning, 36 hours after Daniel walked out the door. A junior technician on the new managed services contract noticed that the backup replication jobs had failed silently for 2 consecutive cycles, and when he tried to access the failover configuration to understand why, he found himself staring at a system with no documentation, custom scripts with cryptic names, and a network topology that did not match any diagram in the onboarding folder Hartwell had provided. He escalated it. The senior engineer who got the call spent 4 hours trying to reverse engineer a decade of undocumented decisions before he gave up and escalated it further, and by the time the sun rose, the authentication server that governed access to nearly every internal system at Hartwell had crashed under a load balancing failure nobody understood how to fix. And it took the rest of the network down with it like a row of dominoes. Vivian arrived at the office at 7:15, the way she always did, coffee in hand, and she knew something was wrong before she reached her floor because the elevator badge reader would not accept her credentials. She had to be let in by a security guard using an old physical key. Inside, the office was chaos in the particular, quiet, controlled way that corporate chaos looks. People standing in small clusters, phones pressed to ears, the low murmur of panic dressed up in professional vocabulary. Every screen she passed was either frozen, blank, or displaying an error message referencing servers she'd never heard of. Her assistant met her at the door with a face that told her everything before she said a word. "We're completely down," her assistant said. "Email, the client portal, order processing, all of it. The engineers from the new contractors say they can't get in far enough to even see the extent of the damage. They keep using the word undocumented like it's a curse word." Vivian stood very still in the middle of her own lobby and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though nothing physically moved. She thought of the printout with the red circle around a name. She thought of the man in the charcoal. No, she had worn charcoal. He had worn a gray fleece and steady hands. And the sentence he'd said to her, "You'll want to keep that thought in mind." And, for the first time she understood, it had not been a threat at all. It had been a warning, offered plainly, by a man with no reason left to offer her anything. By 9 that morning, Hartwell's stock, which traded modestly but steadily on a regional exchange where institutional investors watched infrastructure companies closely, had dropped 11% on unconfirmed reports of a total systems outage affecting client deliverables. By 11, it was down 18%, and financial reporters who covered small-cap tech were making calls to Hartwell's public relations line that nobody could answer because the phone system itself ran through the same authentication server that was down. Marcus stormed into Vivian's office looking, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely rattled, his expensive haircut slightly disheveled, and he told her the contracted engineers were saying flatly that whoever built this infrastructure had built it to be understood only by himself, that there was no map, no key, nothing. "Get him back," Marcus said. "Whatever it takes." "You wanted him gone," Vivian said. And she was surprised at how little heat was in her own voice because she was too busy doing arithmetic in her head, the arithmetic of just how much of this collapse was her own signature on a termination letter. "I wanted to save $400,000, Marcus snapped. "I didn't know he was the only person on earth who understood how any of this worked." Vivian looked at her cousin for a long moment and thought, not for the first time, that his confidence had always been a kind of costume, expensive fabric draped over an absence of real understanding, and she wondered, with a coldness that surprised her, how much of the last 3 years of his advice had been built on the same kind of costume. But there was no time for that thought to finish forming because her phone rang, and the caller identification showed a name she had not seen in 3 years, the name of the man who had built this company from nothing and handed it to her, with a level of trust she was only now beginning to understand she may not have earned. Her father's voice, when she answered, was calm in a way that made the chaos around her feel briefly very far away. "I saw the stock," Walter Cole said. "I saw the outage reports. And I need you to do something before you panic any further." "Vivian, I need you to sit down." She did not sit down. She stood at her window overlooking a parking lot full of client cars that would not be getting service today, and she said, "Dad, I don't have time for a lecture right now." "This isn't a lecture," he said, and something in his voice, some old, careful gravity, made her go quiet and listen. 10 years ago, when I was still running things, I brought on a young systems architect. Brilliant, the kind of brilliant you see once in a career. He'd come out of a defense contracting background, high-level clearance work, the kind of thing where you don't get to talk about what you used to do. His wife had just died. He had a baby daughter, and he needed a quiet life, and he needed money he could count on without traveling or exposure, and I needed someone who could build me an infrastructure that would carry this company for decades without me having to think about it twice. I paid him a technician's salary, because that's what he asked for. But I also gave him something else. I gave him equity. 6% of Hartwell Systems, structured through a private holding trust, so it wouldn't show up on any employee roster or trigger disclosure requirements while I was still privately held. Nobody knew, not the board. Not you. It was the only way he'd agree to stay quiet and build something extraordinary without being treated like an executive he didn't want to be. Vivian felt something cold move down through her chest. "Whew," she said. Though some part of her already knew, some part of her was already replaying a gray fleece and a quiet sentence and a box with a coffee mug in it. "Daniel Reyes," her father said. "The man you just fired. 6% of a company now worth, even after this morning's crash, somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million. And Vivian, listen to me carefully, because this matters more than the stock price. He is also the only human being alive who can put your servers back together. And after what you let happen to him, he has absolutely no obligation to lift a single finger to help you." Vivian did not remember hanging up the phone. She remembered standing at the window for a long time, the parking lot blurring slightly, and she remembered thinking, with a kind of vertigo she had not felt since her father first put her in that office 3 years ago, that she had spent an entire career learning to read financial statements and had somehow never learned to read a person standing directly in front of her. Daniel was in his garage when the call came through, not from Hartwell, but from his lawyer, a semi-retired estate attorney named Ruth Kessler, who had handled the original trust paperwork 10 years ago and had quietly managed his equity position ever since, filing the necessary paperwork each year, telling no one, exactly as Walter Cole had arranged it. Daniel had known, of course, he had always known what he owned, but he had never touched it, never spoken of it, because the money had never been the point. The point had been the quiet. The point had been Sophie's Wednesdays. Ruth's voice on the phone was uncharacteristically urgent. "The stock is in free fall," she said, "which means your position is dropping by the hour. But Daniel, that's not why I'm calling. Walter Cole called me 40 minutes ago. He wants to arrange a meeting between you and Vivian. He says the whole company is dark, and only you can bring it back." Daniel stood in his garage with a wrench still in his hand. Halfway through fixing the same lawnmower he'd been fixing every spring for 6 years, and he felt the old, familiar pull of being needed by people who had never needed him as a person, only as a function, a fixer, a mechanism to be plugged back in once it became inconvenient that they'd removed him. He thought about saying no. He had every right to say no. He had built 10 years of quiet dignity on the principle that his time belonged to himself and his daughter, and Hartwell had made it very clear, in one flat sentence from a woman in a charcoal suit, that they considered him replaceable. But then he thought of the people still working there, the ones who had nothing to do with Marcus Doyle's ambitions or Vivian Cole's cost-cutting, the receptionist who always asked about Sophie, the woman in accounting who'd brought him soup once when he had the flu. Ordinary people whose jobs and paychecks were now hanging by the thread of a system only he understood. And he thought, too, in a quieter, more private corner of his mind, about the sentence he'd said to Vivian on his way out the door. You'll want to keep that thought in mind, and he wondered if she had, in fact, kept it in mind, or if she had simply filed it away like everything else and moved on to her next meeting. He told Ruth he would meet with them, but on his own terms. Vivian arrived at the small, unremarkable diner Daniel had chosen, not a boardroom, not Hartwell's offices, a diner 3 miles from his house with cracked vinyl booths and a bell over the door, and she felt distinctly out of place in her tailored coat among people eating pancakes at 11 in the morning. Daniel was already seated when she arrived, a cup of black coffee in front of him, and he did not stand when she approached the booth, which she noted with a strange, small flicker of respect she did not expect to feel. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I didn't come for you," Daniel said, not unkindly, just plainly. "I came because there are people still working there who didn't do anything to deserve what's happening to their jobs." Right now, Vivian absorbed that. It was, she realized, a more generous motive than she had offered anyone in a long time. "My father told me about the equity," she said. "I want you to know I had no idea." "If I had known, you still would have fired me?" Daniel said, and it was not bitter, just simply unmistakably true, and Vivian did not argue because she suspected he was right. "The equity isn't why I'm here. I want to be clear about that. I don't need Hartwell's money, and I never built anything down in that server room because I wanted to be indispensable. I built it because I was good at my job and I liked doing it well. That used to matter to me before. I had a kid, it still matters. Just not more than she does." "What do you need?" Vivian asked, and it came out smaller than she intended, less like a chief executive negotiating and more like a person asking a genuine question. Daniel studied her for a long moment, the way he might study a system throwing errors he hadn't seen before, looking for the actual source underneath the surface symptom. "I need to know why you fired me in the first place," he said. "Not the official reason. The real one." Vivian opened her mouth to give him the corporate answer, restructuring, cost efficiency, managed services, and found to her own surprise that she didn't want to. "Marcus told me you were coasting," he said slowly. "I didn't check. I didn't ask anyone what you actually did. I looked at a salary number, and I made a decision to look decisive in front of the board, because I have spent 3 years terrified that everyone secretly believes I only have this job because of my last name. And I took that fear out on a line item instead of doing the actual work of understanding what the line item did." She stopped, faintly startled at her own honesty, because she had rehearsed a much smoother answer on the drive over and had abandoned it entirely somewhere around the second sentence. Daniel nodded slowly, and something in his face shifted, Not warmth exactly, but the loosening of a held posture. "That's the first true thing anyone from Hartwell has said to me in 10 years, he said. They sat with that for a moment, the diner clattering quietly around them, and then Daniel said he would come in. He would fix the network, but he had conditions, and he listed them without hesitation, like a man who had thought about exactly this moment more than he wanted to admit. He would work on-site only during school hours, 9 to 2, no exceptions, because Sophie came first, and always would. He would document everything this time, every system, every dependency, in plain language, so that no single person's presence or absence could ever again threaten to collapse the entire company. And he wanted not a management title, not a corner office, but a formal written acknowledgement, filed with the board, that his equity position and his technical authority over infrastructure decisions were permanent and could not be quietly stripped away by the next executive who decided he looked replaceable on paper. Vivian said yes to all of it, before he'd even finished the last sentence. What she did not expect was Marcus. Marcus Doyle had spent the last 24 hours watching his cost-cutting initiative detonate his cousin's company, and by extension, his own standing with the board. And rather than absorb any responsibility, he did what men like Marcus always did when cornered. He looked for someone else to blame, loudly enough that nobody would examine his own decisions too closely. He called an emergency session of the board for that same evening, framing it not as a discussion of the outage, but as a referendum on Vivian's judgment. And by the time Vivian and Daniel arrived at Hartwell's headquarters together, the boardroom was already half full of directors murmuring about whether the chief executive chair needed new leadership. Marcus stood at the head of the table when Vivian walked in, and he did not sit down when she did, which was, Vivian recognized immediately, a small performance of dominance for the board's benefit. He gestured toward Daniel, seated slightly apart, still in the same plain gray fleece he'd worn the day he was fired, and said, loudly enough for the whole room, "This is the man responsible for building an infrastructure so undocumented, so amateurish, that one person's absence took down our entire company in 36 hours. And now our chief executive wants to reward him with an equity acknowledgement and a permanent seat at the technical table. I'd call that grifting. I'd call it a single father showing up at exactly the moment his sob story is most convenient, looking for a payday off a crisis he may well have engineered on his way out the door." The accusation landed hard and ugly in the room, and Vivian felt the old instinct rise in her. The instinct to stay quiet, to let the board sort it out, to protect her own position by not attaching herself too visibly to either side. She had spent 3 years surviving by exactly that kind of careful neutrality. But she looked at Daniel, sitting very still, his jaw tight, but his hands folded calmly on the table, a man who had already been discarded once by people who never bothered to understand him. And she thought of Sophie, whom she had never met, waiting at home for a father who showed up every single day, no matter what the world did to him. And something in Vivian simply refused to stay quiet this time. "That's not true, and you know it isn't," Vivian said, standing, and her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with a clarity that surprised even her. "Daniel didn't engineer this collapse. You did, Marcus. The moment you told me to fire the one person holding this company's infrastructure together, without checking whether we could survive without him. And before anyone in this room repeats the word grifter again, you should know that Daniel Reyes has already turned down 2 consulting rates higher than what we're offering him, because his condition for coming back had nothing to do with money. It had to do with making sure something like this never happens to another employee again." Daniel, who had said almost nothing since walking into the boardroom, finally spoke, and his voice was quiet. But the room went instantly still around it the way rooms do, around people who rarely need to raise their voice to be heard. "I can show you exactly what happened to your systems, in plain language, on that screen right now, if someone will give me a laptop," he said. "And while I'm doing that, I think you should also ask Marcus why the managed services contract he pushed so hard for was signed with a company his brother-in-law happens to have a financial stake in. That's public record if anyone wants to check it." The room did not merely go quiet, it went cold. Vivian turned to look at Marcus, and for the first time in 3 years of watching him perform easy confidence in every meeting, she saw something crack open in his face. A flicker of panic, quickly smoothed back over, but not quickly enough. a member of the board. An older woman named Constance Ahn, who had served on Hartwell's board since Vivian's father founded the company, and who rarely spoke unless it mattered, folded her hands and said quietly that she would like the vendor contract pulled and reviewed immediately, and that until it was, she thought it wildly inappropriate for Marcus to be leading any conversation about the ethics of anyone else's employment. Daniel spent the next 2 hours at that boardroom table with a borrowed laptop, walking the board, in plain, patient language, through exactly what had failed and why, and exactly what it would take to fix it. No jargon, no posturing, just the calm competence of a man who had genuinely understood every piece of what he built. He explained the authentication server dependency chain the way a good teacher explains something to a room full of people who have never had to think about it before, and Vivian watched him do it and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a tidy word for yet. She had spent 3 years surrounded by people who spoke confidently about things they barely understood, Marcus chief among them, and she had mistaken that confidence for competence more times than she wanted to admit. Daniel had the opposite instinct entirely. He spoke plainly because he actually knew what he was talking about. And the plainness was, she realized, its own kind of quiet authority. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted, with only Marcus dissenting, to suspend him, pending a full investigation into the vendor contract, and to formally reinstate Daniel with full authority over infrastructure decisions, along with a written equity acknowledgement he had asked for. Marcus left the building that night without saying a word to anyone, his expensive coat pulled tight around him, and within a week, the investigation had confirmed exactly what Daniel suspected: an undisclosed financial relationship with the managed services vendor, kickbacks structured through consulting fees. The entire cost-cutting campaign against Daniel's position, revealed as a scheme to funnel Hartwell's technology budget toward a company Marcus quietly profited from. The board removed him entirely, and legal proceedings followed that Vivian did not enjoy watching, but did not try to soften either, because for the first time in 3 years, she found she valued being right over being comfortable. The network came back online in stages over the following 4 days, Daniel working his negotiated hours, 9 to 2, documenting every system in plain language as he went, teaching 2 junior technicians how to actually understand what they were maintaining instead of simply hoping nothing broke. Hartwell's stock recovered most of its losses within 2 weeks, once the market understood the outage had been a contained, human-caused failure rather than evidence of deeper structural rot. And Vivian found herself, for the first time since taking the chief executive chair, actually enjoying the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding something properly instead of chasing the appearance of decisiveness. She started showing up at the server room sometimes, not to check on Daniel's work, but because she found she wanted to understand it, wanted to ask the kind of questions her father used to ask before he retired, and she inherited a company she'd never actually learned from the ground up. Daniel answered her questions patiently, the same patience she'd watched him extend to junior engineers. And somewhere in those quiet afternoon conversations, structured carefully around the hours he had to leave to pick up Sophie, Vivian began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with servers at all. The careful, unhurried way he explained things, the way he never spoke over anyone, never postured, never needed to be the smartest person in the room, even when he plainly was. She noticed, too, that she had started arranging her own schedule around the hours she knew he'd be there, and she was self-aware enough to recognize what that meant, even if she was not yet ready to say it out loud. The first time she met Sophie was an accident, in the way most important things in life arrive as accidents. Daniel had to bring her to the office one Wednesday afternoon, when a school half-day collided badly with a critical system migration he could not postpone, and Vivian found the 2 of them in the break room, Sophie doing homework at a table while Daniel worked quietly beside her on a laptop, occasionally leaning over to check a math problem. Vivian stood in the doorway for a moment, unnoticed, and watched something she had genuinely never seen before in her professional life: a person being simultaneously excellent at demanding work and unhurriedly present as a parent, as though the 2 things had never once seemed, to him, like competing obligations. Sophie noticed her first. "Are you the boss lady?" she asked with the direct, unfiltered curiosity of a 9-year-old, and Daniel looked up, faintly embarrassed, and started to apologize for his daughter's bluntness, but Vivian laughed. An actual laugh, unguarded, the kind she could not remember producing in a boardroom in years. "I am the boss lady," Vivian said, crouching slightly to be closer to Sophie's eye level. "I made a big mistake with your dad a little while ago. I'm trying to fix it." Sophie considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "He doesn't stay mad at people," she said. "He says being mad takes up room you need for other things." Vivian looked at Daniel over his daughter's head, and he held her gaze for a beat, longer than either of them probably intended, and neither of them said anything, because there are moments where the important things pass silently between two people, and no words are required to carry them. Over the following months, Hartwell changed in ways that went beyond its server architecture. Vivian instituted a policy, over the muted grumbling of a few remaining board members loyal to old habits, that no position could be eliminated without a documented, board-reviewed understanding of its actual function, closing the exact loophole that had let Marcus's ambition nearly destroy the company. She started spending real time on the operations floor, not performing visibility for optics, but genuinely learning the business her father had built from people who actually built it daily. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the company ran better, and that she slept better, when she led with curiosity instead of control. Daniel, for his part, kept his hours exactly as negotiated, 9 to 2, every day. No exceptions, and Hartwell adjusted around him rather than the other way around, which was, Vivian had come to understand, exactly how it should have been all along. He was never given a corner office. He never asked for one. He kept his quiet gray fleece and his badge and his afternoons with Sophie, and the company was stronger for every part of that arrangement remaining unchanged. It was a Tuesday evening in early autumn when Vivian found herself at Daniel's house for the first time. Invited for what he'd called, with characteristic understatement, a thank-you dinner, though she suspected, watching Sophie set the table with unusual ceremony, that more was being marked than gratitude. They ate on the back porch, the last of the summer light going soft and gold across a small, unremarkable yard, and after Sophie had gone inside to finish a show, she was allowed exactly 30 more minutes of Vivian. Found herself alone, with Daniel in the quiet, the way she had, without quite admitting it to herself, been hoping to be for weeks. "I've been thinking about what you said to me," she said. "On your way out the door the day I fired you, you told me to keep that thought in mind. I didn't understand what you meant for a long time." Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly on the table. "I didn't mean it as a threat," he said. "I want you to know that. I wasn't thinking about the equity or the servers when I said it. I was thinking that you just told me I was replaceable. And I was thinking about how many times in my life people have decided that about me, because I don't perform importance the way some people do. I wanted you to sit with that decision. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted you to actually learn something from it, for your own sake, not mine." "I did learn something," Vivian said. "I learned that I've spent 3 years mistaking loud confidence for competence and quiet competence for nothing at all. I don't think I would have caught that in myself if the servers hadn't gone down. I don't love that. It took a crisis, but I'm grateful for what came out the other side of it." Daniel looked at her for a long moment in the fading light, and something in his face, careful for so long, guarded in the particular way of a man who had built a wall around himself brick by brick since his wife died, seemed to ease, just slightly, just enough. "I wasn't sure I'd ever trust anyone from a boardroom again," he said. "I built a very small, very safe life around that decision. Sophie, this house, work I could leave behind at 2 o'clock every day. I wasn't looking to let anyone else in, and now," Vivian asked quietly, not entirely sure she wanted to hear the answer, and equally sure she needed to. "Now I think maybe I was wrong to assume it had to be all or nothing," Daniel said. "Maybe some people are worth making room for, even if it's complicated." They did not kiss that evening, and they did not make any grand declaration, because that was not who either of them had become through everything that happened. But Vivian reached across the small table and rested her hand over his, and he turned his palm upward to meet hers, and they sat like that in the quiet, gathering dark. While inside the house, Sophie's show played faintly through the screen door, and neither of them felt any need to fill the silence with more than that. 6 months later, Hartwell Systems held its annual shareholder meeting in a building with servers that ran, for the first time in a decade, on infrastructure fully documented and understood by more than one person, though everyone in the technology department still, half-jokingly, called Daniel the last word on anything that broke. Vivian stood at the podium and spoke, not about growth projections or cost efficiencies, but about the cost of treating people as replaceable line items, instead of as the reason a company survives its own crises. And she meant every word of it in a way she could not have 3 years earlier. Afterward, in the parking lot, Daniel was waiting, Sophie beside him in a jacket 2 sizes too big that had clearly once been his, and Vivian walked toward them without hurrying, because, for the first time in a very long time, she was not in a rush to be anywhere else. What began as a callous dismissal, one woman's careless certainty that anyone could be replaced, ended instead as proof of the opposite, that the quietest people in a room are often carrying the most weight, and that real strength rarely announces itself. It simply shows up every day at 9 o'clock, because there is somewhere more important to be. Vivian Cole had inherited a company built on her father's instincts, but it took losing nearly everything to learn the one lesson he never got to teach her directly, that a business, like a life, only holds together because of the people willing to quietly hold it, whether or not anyone above them ever thinks to say thank you. In the end, she said it, and in the golden light of an ordinary parking lot, with a 9-year-old girl swinging their joined hands between them, that was enough.